This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit podcast. I'm Kay Savitz. Dr. Brenda Laurel worked at Atari from 1980 through 1984. She began as software specialist for educational applications, then soon became manager of software strategy for the home computer division. In mid-1982, she joined Atari Corporate Research at the Sunnyvale Research Laboratory, where she worked with Alan Kay. After Atari, she worked for Activision as Director of Software Development. Later, she founded Purple Moon, a software company focused on creating games for young girls, and co-founded Telepresence Research, a company focused on first-person media and virtual reality. This interview took place on July 15, 2021. Check the show notes at ataripodcast.com for links to articles that Brenda wrote for Atari Connection magazine, her doctoral dissertation toward the design of a computer-based interactive fantasy system, scans of memos on the subject of interactive fantasy that she wrote while at Atari Research, and more.
Before Atari, I was working on my Master's of Fine Arts degree in acting at Ohio State University, and then passed my PhD generals. This was around 1975. And a friend of mine who worked at Battelle Memorial Institute and was in charge of computer graphics, and I got fairly stoned, and he took me over there to show me images coming in from Viking. And I sort of went crazy. Like, what is this? I want to do this. This is so cool. So he, a year later, he and a colleague from Battelle started a little computer game company, or I should say computer entertainment company, using an 1802 processor and 2K of usable RAM, loaded from audio cassette. So I was designing interactive fairy tales on that machine.
That was the Cybervision system, right?
Yeah, I'm doing things like lip syncing because I didn't know I couldn't, because there was so little RAM. We had these converging nodes because we were loading from cassette tape. Anyway, that company did pretty well for its time. I mean, it was my first, but certainly not last, crash dummy experience. So we went out of business primarily because Atari showed up and they started selling lots of stuff. And eventually, one by one, the Cybervision people went to Atari, and I got hired into the marketing group for the 400-800 computer. And my job was to do educational software at the beginning. But then as my career moved around there, I became manager of software development, which is kind of a misnomer. I was actually in charge of the group that produced all the software for the 400 and 800. Sometimes that meant original content, and sometimes it meant that we were asked to spend ridiculous amounts of our budget porting things like Ms. Pac-Man, which fundamentally made no sense if you were trying to differentiate a computer from a game machine. So I was crossways a lot with management, but that's what I ended up doing. And then when things got rough, I went to the lab and worked for Alan Kay.
Okay. Before we get to the lab, I'd like to spend some more time in your early years, which you don't sound like you were happy with there. But so tell me about the educational software and the software strategy. What were you trying to do? What was the company trying to do? And tell me about some of the projects you worked on there, please.
Boy, you mean it. Okay, well, I moved pretty quickly out of educational into everything. So, but in the educational side, we produced a pilot programming language and a few other things. But the department I inherited was doing everything from games to whatever else came along. I think initially what the company wanted to do was to build a new revenue stream and to compete with the Apple II, but they weren't strategic. I mean, these are now Warner people, so they weren't strategically savvy enough to think about product differentiation. So they were all about, in the beginning, porting games like Battlezone and Pac-Man and Dig Dug, all great games, over to the 400-800. The performance was not as good for the games, but I suppose if you had bought a 400 or 800, you might want to play some Atari games, that's fine. But at every turn, when I would mention something like, say, word processing or spreadsheets or personal finance or self-improvement, I would get a no from Ray Kassar, who was president of all of Atari. My boss, Roger Badisher, understood better what the objective should be, strategically speaking. And one day, I can remember Ray did this thing of saying, you're going to spend 75% of your development budget porting Ms. Pac-Man to the 400, 800. And I went into my boss's office, who was the president of the Atari Home Computer Division, and I got on his chalkboard and said, look, here is all the empty space we could be occupying in the realm of interactive software, and drew pictures for him and talked my brains out. And at the end of that meeting, he said, your salary's doubled and you report to me. So that's how I got involved in software strategy. But I can remember when Roger went to visit the guys at Warner after the company was acquired. He came back and he said to me in his Midwestern drawl, Brenda, it's stupid all the way to the top. So we got a clue that Warner was not serious, really, about either the game business or the computer business. In fact, there's another story I can tell you about that.
Please.
So the Warner management convened a brain trust sort of meeting to talk about the future of the industry. And I was there with Davis Maston, who's a great branding and research guy. Stuart Brand. Stuart Brand.
Whole Earth catalog.
Stuart Brand. Some other luminaries, people who were in those days, people I looked up to were famous. And I can remember Stuart Brand saying, well, I think computer games are going to end up having been a hobby like jogging. This is 1981. As we know, jogging persisted unto this day, and so did computer games. But when Stuart said that, Davis and I just looked at each other like, what the fuck did that guy just say? It was pretty funny. Am I allowed to use bad words?
Please, I encourage it. From the outsider's perspective, from my perspective, it seemed like in those early days, Atari was trying to do a lot of things to find new markets and find new strategies. I mean, they had a program for learning speed reading and one where you could connect a science lab for temperature sensors and things to your computer. It seemed like in those early days, they were going all out to do interesting things other than just porting games, as well as porting games.
That was probably after the program that sent me to the lab, because none of those products came through my group.
I see.
Unless they were running on the game console.
No, I'm talking about the 400, 800.
Oh. So I went to the lab in 81, I think, late 80, 81. So that was my escape hatch from the home computer division. Part of what was going on there was the politics of queerness. The most powerful members of upper management in the company, most of them were what I would call the femophobic flavor of gay man, the Joan Crawford people. They didn't like us at all. And as a gender fluid person, although I didn't know those words then, my gay friend Greg, who works in customer support, and I co-founded the Atari Gay Association for all of the queer people we knew in the company who weren't that kind of person, who weren't hateful and resentful. And there was a way in which that visibility, I think, really irked them, that we had shown up, and proclaimed there's some queer people here and they're not you. Probably made it a little harder for me. But at the end of the day, Ray really I mean, the company didn't like me pushing on the kind of innovation you're talking about. They really wanted to stick with games because they thought they were going to make their money and get out. That's my impression.
Yeah.
And when I moved to the lab, it was because Ray was gunning for me. I had learned, through the grapevine that I was going to get fired, and I knew that they'd hired Alan Kay over there. And so I ran across the street, said, Alan, help me, save me. I'm a good person. I have lots of good ideas. I'm writing a PhD thesis on virtual reality, which it wasn't called that yet. But so bless his heart, he hired me. And pretty much everybody else there at that time were graduates of the architecture machine group, which is what the MIT Media Lab was called that last year. And then it switched over. So all these MIT guys were there, and me and Chris Crawford, who were the only outsiders. But I got to completely change what I was about. I got to look at stuff like brain scans and VR and different models for different game mechanics than we had been used to. Social game mechanics, Chris was really good at. So it opened a whole new world to me. And it also stimulated my dissertation a great deal to be working with Alan and all those wonderful MIT folks, Scott Fisher, whom I later formed a company with to do VR, and Mary and Rachel Strickland, who's still a great colleague and a wonderful videographer. These guys were real brain food for me. Suddenly I wasn't a theater guy and I wasn't a computer game guy. I was like doing research on important stuff. And the vision that opened up for me then was, it's like, I want it to be like a waking dream. I want to put my hand in there, and I don't want any fucking interface. I don't want knobs. I don't want inventories. I could maybe put up with the data glove, which wasn't quite there yet, but would be soon. But later on at Interval, we had a group called the No Fucking Interface group that was trying to get this kind of direct interaction. By that time, I'd become friends with Henry Jenkins. So, yeah,
Nice.
fun.
Just going back a little bit, how did the anti-gay, anti-woman stuff manifest itself?
Discrimination and sexism, inappropriate joking, name calling, not having a seat at the table.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say which was the worst offense to those guys, being your basic queer person or your basic woman. It's not clear. But they put their foot down, and women in the company generally had pretty low level roles. I think I got lucky because I had some experience. And I know over on the game side, Carol was there and there were other people doing really amazing work in the console side. So that may have helped. I mean, there might have been a little, what do you call that when a truck drives behind another truck real close, they get a draft.
Right, the drafting, yeah.
Right. So the women on the console side probably helped me in my career, even though I wasn't close to them at the time.
Did your boss ask you to come up with program from software ideas for software for women? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So one of the conversations I had with Roger was, he said, what would women like? What would women do with the computer? And I was a pretty rabid individual in those days. So my boyfriend, who also worked at Atari, and I got really stoned and came up with these ridiculous programs like Atari Appliance Command, the stretch mark editor, which might have presaged Photoshop, I'm not sure, the Atari Home Pelvic Exam, but from that, and so, he got the point and we all laughed it off. But from that day, I have had a computer in my kitchen. I keep recipes and groceries.
Sure.
It's just sort of a...
And that was like the thing back in the day. Oh, you can store your recipes on it. You can balance your checkbook on it, right?
Well, I actually do that now. And I get a sick pleasure out of it.
Was your point that all software should be for women, or what were you trying to get at with those snarky ideas?
Well, I think so. Stepping back, the observation is that Atari was a strangely vertically integrated company. It was built by young men, for young men, sold in places where young men went. And it never occurred to them that there was another market, that women were gamers. Even though we had these lovely people over in the women on the console side, the company never grokked that women could be their audience. And so it's insulting to think, well, a woman, of course, wouldn't use a word processor. A woman, of course, wouldn't play Pac-Man. Well, Pac-Man did better with women than men at the end of the day.
Right.
And I had a programmer once tell me that was because Pac-Man was about an eating disorder. Anyway, yeah, I think it was just an equity thing. It was like, are you guys stupid? Maybe we don't want to play first-person shooters, although I loved Star Raiders dearly. But we're people, first, and we're not people running around in little aprons. The whole premise of that question struck me as extremely sexist and bad business. Bad business. I can remember when I finally got to Interval and was able to start working on games for little girls, my boss there said, there's this multi-billion-dollar industry with an empty lot next door. And it's just because, didn't see it. That prejudice that rides along with women don't do math and tech, rode along with Atari, and games were part of that. And it wasn't really until the introduction of the internet that people started to see it. I mean, Roberta Williams games, yes. Text adventures, yes. Driving games, girls loved them. Atari didn't twig to the fact that a lot of their players for pole position were girls. And it's because I learned in my gender research, we do better with a first-person view in gaming. So it was an ingrained prejudice that you could not crack.
I understand. But at Interval, at Purple Moon, you famously made all sorts of games for little girls. Were you thinking about games for girls when you were at Atari, or was that too soon?
I think I was being gender neutral at Atari because it's kind of gender neutral myself. As I grew up in the industry, I worked at Activision. I did work with Lucasfilm. And by the way, LucasArts never did this sexist crap. They built games that were accessible to anybody and had some female characters at least, and so, but I had been down the road with the game industry for 15 years before I got to Interval. And I think during those 15 years, I had gotten angrier and angrier that as I was watching, so girls and women's interest in technology fields declining, university enrollments for women in computer science and tech declining, and it became so clear to me that nobody had ever made anything that made them want to put their hands on the computer specifically for them, that would lift up the feminine. That's not to say, girls are gamers, and now we know for sure females are at least probably almost half, if not more than, of the gaming public is female today, although only about 20% or less of game developers are female today. So that continues to be a problem. I'm sorry, I'm rambling. It's something that just grew in me. Sure. That I had a social mission around getting girls engaged with technology because I knew that it was so important. And that there was this line of bullshit about how girls and women don't do math and don't do, completely obliterating the memories of the first computers who were women and on and on. I mean, it was just like erased history and erased aptitude as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I can remember when I tried to take calculus in high school, I was the only girl in the class and pretty quickly got run out of Dodge by the boys. So, that was in 1965 or something. So, long time of steaming up. And as I was raising girls myself, uh, female children, it became more acute to me as an issue as I watched their little computer labs in elementary school and stuff. And the boys were all up there pounding away, and the girls were sitting in the back, except my daughter, who was writing code, but that's my daughter,
Sure.
one of my daughters. Anyway, it just it steamed me. And
Sure.
as I started studying the issue and looking at quote gender differences, be they cultural or biological, they're there. This prejudice I'm just talking about, that's a gender difference as much as a pretty indisputable one, biologically speaking, is that um, girls perform less well than boys at mental rotation tasks under time pressure. If there's no time pressure, performance equalizes. Okay, that's important for a couple of reasons. You look at a girl playing a game, say on a keyboard or with a joystick. So we have the translation from the plane of the keyboard to the plane of the screen. That's one mental rotation. And if it's a side scroller, and we know that girls and women tend to be first person navigators, there's another rotation, right? So it slows down your performance. It looks like you suck. And your brother's going to give you a hard time. You can't play this game. Shit. So if you look at a game like Pole Position or there's another one that I always think of, a running animal uh, game. Those first person games were a piece of cake for girls. They still had the translation issue, but they didn't have the big mental rotation, that two curls in one kind of problem. That's pretty stable science. So that's at one end of the spectrum of gender difference. And at the other end is just the kind of mythology we were talking about and the way we're all trained and made to believe that there are certain things we can and can't do and shouldn't do, just like straight people and gay people. It's just, that, that,
That.
just the thing. I'm
Um,
also a nice person. I mean, I can be a nice person. I just ranted at you.
I'm here to hear what you have to say. I just feel frustrated in listening to your talk because, of course, most of these issues have not been solved, and women are even if they're women and girls are 50% of the gamers, they're still ostracized and pushed out by male gamers and Gamergate and all that garbage that still
Yeah.
continues today.
Yeah. Well, I think the gamer guy, the primary vitriol there is aimed at women who develop games, who
Sure.
design games. Not some, although players get it too. I mean, if you get outed as a female in
Right.
certain scenarios in Warcraft, for
Fake
example,
gamer girl and all
yeah,
that.
you can catch a bunch of shit.
Yeah.
So it's difficult, but I don't think it's as toxic for female players, generally speaking, as it is for female devs. And man, I still see it going on. When I compare the sort of plain vanilla homophobic, racist, sexist crap that I had to deal with early, the stuff that's happening now is so much nastier, so much worse. Nobody made death threats to me, when I was starting out. Nobody told me I should go kill myself.
Yeah.
This is like powers of 10 worse now in some ways than it was then.
Okay, so you feel like you're gonna lose your job in software, so you go over to Alan Kay and you're like, "Hey, I'm cool. Give me a job in the research lab." Tell me about that. Tell me about the first day of that.
Whoa, it was so neat. Well, I got to meet everybody. I already had met some of the people, like Scott Fisher, I'd known for a while. Um, mm, Scott was working on some quasi VR related stuff. Actually brought in a couple of people myself to that lab too. Um, I think it was, kind of the VR swoon for me to get in there. I know people in the lab were working on all kinds of things like gestural interfaces and stuff, but for me, it was this much closer to what I had always imagined. When I was an actor, you're walking into a life and a situation that's not yours. And I learned to be a good actor, you have to shine a flashlight around in your brain until you find that character or part of that character inside of you. And that there's this enormous freedom when you do that. And yeah, you have to memorize lines, but the way you play the part, the way you move through that world is just a voyage of discovery and delight, and improvisation even more so, frankly, because you're making up your own lines. I had always wanted that. When I was an actor, I wanted that. Maybe this is some sort of disorder. I don't know, but to have that pleasure, um, was something I wanted to make available to people who weren't actors, who had dreams they wish they could hang around in more. um, I ended up working, by the way, a little bit with Ray Bradbury on my PhD thesis.
I was going to ask you about that
Yeah.
project next.
So I was a big fan of Ray Bradbury's work. I think the first thing I read of his was a short story, but I can't remember. I remember approaching him about using Something Wicked This Way Comes as a kind of an environmental character action prototyping space for my ideas around VR, and writing that carousel and the lightning rod and the swirling around. I mean, it was so kinesthetic. That story was. A lot of his stories were. Childhood's End would have been too hard, but it was a great opportunity to think with somebody who was a futurist in his own way, and to use this beautiful work as a platform for myself to think about what it would take to do what I wanted.
And this was something that you were actually trying to put on to create a media environment where he could be the playwright of someone playing through Something Wicked This Way Comes.
It was way too early to think about building that.
Yeah.
But designing it was important. I mean, let's figure out what are the capabilities that will be necessary to make this possible. And let's say you're playing this character, what choices might you make? How might we design the environment such that you are nudged into thinking of your own free will? You're making dramatically interesting choices. So it was an opportunity to have really deep discourse about what future systems would look like and what might be necessary, what we could do, maybe what we never could do. So yeah, it was a thought process. It was not something you could even think about building yet, I don't think. I mean, you can barely think about building such a thing today.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's the point of the research lab, is to look into the future, and right. So you did some artificial intelligence work to try to improve the quality and variability of interactive games. An AI system based on Aristotle's poetics to generate compelling new scenarios for computer games. I don't understand what Aristotle's poetics is. Maybe you can go into detail for someone like me.
Well, okay. When we were thinking at the lab about what it would take to manifest the kind of system I just described, you would want some constraints in place that, as I said, encouraged people to make dramatically interesting choices. I chose the wrong flavor of AI. At the time, I thought, well, let's do this with an expert system, because I'd met Doug Leonard, and he ended up being on my PhD committee. And let's model that expert system on Aristotle's observations about what makes a good play. Later theorist named Freytag made this curve of action that's become a really important tool for designing dramatic structure, for example. And Aristotle talked about things like reversals, like, what? I was expecting it to be sunny, but it's raining and there's lightning. And what that does to your metabolism as you read it or see it enacted, or if you're enacting it, if you're outside, what's going on there. So a reversal is an interesting thing. The tension of unanswered questions, needing to find things out. There's a way in which rising action and drama is really increasing numbers of questions. And falling action, which happens pretty much faster, is the answerings of those questions. Now, there are little curvy things in between in the rising action. And one thing I learned from studying this is that the smaller changes in the curve tend to be self-similar at scale to the larger curve of a play. That means it's a fractal. So that means that you can find the fractal signature of the entire shape of Hamlet in one scene. That's an amazing, I mean, that wasn't Doug Leonard, that was me, but to think about it that way, now you can invoke things besides expert systems. You can invoke different kinds of analysis. I spent a long time studying natural language processing, but in those days, and we're talking early 80s, it hadn't come very far. I mean, it's an amazing thing how far it's come today, but we still don't hear naturalistic voices very often. You remember the drunken Swedes and voice speech? So speech processors who generated speech.
Oh, sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those guys. Yeah, we used to call them drunken Swedes. No offense. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, there was some AI. It was the wrong AI, but as time goes by, we learn as the field progresses, other things that we could do.
But some of your concepts came to fruition. You're working on some games with Chris Crawford. I think you worked on the game Gossip with him.
But only as a guy sitting by his chair talking to him. I wasn't a major player in that game, although he probably talked to me more than anybody else. And I worked on a Gaia game with him. I don't think he's produced anything beyond those two, and maybe that battle game he did.
Right, that was this big one, Eastern Front.
Yeah, Eastern Front. Yeah, I didn't work on that one at all, but yeah, Chris is an interesting character.
Can you talk to me about the project with Encyclopedia Britannica?
That was funny. So the guy who represented Encyclopedia Britannica, his name is escaping me right now, had been busted for cheating on a TV quiz show. But now he's at Encyclopedia Britannica, and he's getting Alan and some other folks in the lab had made a relationship with the EB, because Alan had this notion, right, of the Dynabook, which we now know as a laptop, right, that you could carry around, that could see stuff and help you understand it, etc. So one of the projects Alan initiated with EB was, let's do an interactive encyclopedia. And he pulled me into that because he knew I was interested in education and learning and stuff. Well, I had this big argument with the guy. We had done some pretty neat storyboards, and we were into the project a little ways. And I had done a storyboard about whales that had biology, it had Inuit cultural beliefs, it had conservation issues as 3 different voices, interactive, right? Speaking about the same topic from different points of view. Well, the EB guys went crazy and their heads exploded and they said, absolutely not. Luckily, later on at Apple, we got to do that, at least in a prototype. We did a piece on, I was working with Abby Dunn and Christy Rosendahl, this is in the early 90s, and we did a piece on westward movement in American history from a Native perspective, a trapper's perspective, a pioneer woman's perspective. And they had real voices and you could compare and contrast. We didn't get to the point where they could argue with each other, but it was a really neat prototype. So I know that idea had legs. And they just weren't ready to hear it because they were the fucking encyclopedia. And the whole idea that an encyclopedia would go digital and they couldn't go sell those books anymore was probably really threatening to their business model. I don't know. Anyway,
Sure.
I left that project then.
Sure. And they probably, the encyclopedia is the authority that the way we say it is the way it is. And
Right.
the idea of multiple perspectives probably was not
No.
their deal.
I mean, these people don't know anything about epistemology and they run an encyclopedia, you know.
You mentioned whales, which reminded me, I want to ask you about your memo about playing games with dolphins. You
I'm trying to remember.
you wrote a one-page memo that was basically, it's kind of like, what if people could play games with dolphins? Wouldn't it be amazing? And it's kind of like, I can't tell if it's, you wrote it like it's your brilliance, or if this was some sort of cocaine fueled, what was going on with this
Well,
crazy dolphin?
I'm sorry, I'm at that age where I'm losing names. The famous guy who studied dolphins forever
I don't know.
actually had them, pushing lighted buttons underwater to express things. And my good friend Tim Leary had gone swimming with his dolphins, and one of the dolphins basically just needed to masturbate on Timothy's leg, and he was warned by the trainer that if you ask them to stop, they'll bite you. Anyway, smart dolphins were all the rage, and later on, the Coco project with primates at Apple, I was kind of on the sidelines of that, but it wasn't a cocaine fueled thing. If anything, I was stoned. That's marijuana, which is now legal in most places. But I really wondered about it. I mean, and we know now, for example, the assessment of the intelligence of other cetaceans, like whales, comes a lot from interaction with electronic devices. That's a good medium to a certain extent. Whether it's sensing and recreating the song of a whale or training a dolphin to punch lighted buttons, it helps us understand what their intelligence is like. And I don't think anybody in their right mind should be believing that we are the only intelligent species on this planet.
Sure.
So,
talk to me about your boss, Artie Fishel.
well, this was at the Atari Labs. So Alan was gone a lot. He was always taking trips somewhere. And the researchers would be, yeah, Alan's gone again. So one day, a bunch of us decided that we were going to make a new boss that would take Alan's place, or at least be there when he was gone. And we named him Arthur Fishel, Arthur T. Fishel, Artie Fishel for short. And his wife was named Super, I think, Super Fishel. And his son was named Benny Fishel. And he had actually been affiliated with the British Postal Service and had also invented squid jerky. Who knew? Anyway, he came to work at Atari, and we all worked on channeling a voice for this guy, a tone of voice from memos and emails and stuff, and got pretty good at it. I did his actual voice with a vocoder. Laurie Anderson used to use one of those to make my voice lower.
Sure, the voice of authority, right?
Speaking with a British accent and talking. So I actually got his phone number listed in the Atari directory as Dial a Prayer in Boston, which was a great achievement. We also got him an employee number. So yeah, he was pretty real. And this kind of climaxed in a remote presence event. Again, the words weren't there for us yet. This was in 1982. And Douglas Adams was visiting the labs. That's when I met him. Anyway, there was always a big meeting at the lab on Friday afternoons. Everybody, all the researchers, and Scott and a bunch of other people and I and Rachel Strickland had run cable from the conference room back to an office in the back that would carry video, and put some cameras in the conference room. And I got up in drag with a gray beard and mustache, and wore Michael Neymark's jacket. And I did the video conference as Arthur Fishel. And every time the camera cut back to me, they had swapped out the background, so I was in a different place. There was a terrorist who tried to deliver a pizza. We learned that the administrative assistant to Alan had been Miss Wisconsin or something. And we managed to get the film of that from NBC. So we played some of that. But the interesting thing was that even though we were doing live Q&A, most of the researchers in that room thought we were faking it. Because such a thing had not happened before, as far as anybody knew. This couldn't be going on. So later, after this teleconference, I went to lunch with Alan and Doug Adams and Ray Kassar, and the big dudes over in Ray's private chef outfit. And Doug was sitting next to me, and he looks over and he plucks at a piece of crepe hair that's still stuck to my face from removing my beard, and he goes, "It was you, wasn't it?" But I did the Computer Game Developers Conference a couple of years later in drag, and nobody, people I knew well, a foot and a half away, did not recognize me. They thought I was my brother, who is a pretty crude fellow and shorter than I am, by the way. Anyhow, that's the story. And I think it was a great lesson in collaborative design of a persona, collaborative construction of a persona, and the incredulity of the scientists sitting in that room that we could actually pull it off. Says something about, I guess, the prescience of the hack. It was a very good hack.
Yeah. So a social hack.
Yeah.
I love it. And going off that, tell me about the time you tried to purchase a Saturn V rocket.
Oh, that was Eric Cultine who put that one together, but all of us who were in the Arthur Fishel team worked on it. And he put in a purchase order for a Saturn V rocket, and Alan signed it and also added a pack of gum. So it went on up the chain. And some guys from facilities showed up to see where they could put a launch pad. Now, I don't know if they were hacking us back, but boy, that was funny. It was a good day.
Nice.
Eric called himself the director of off-planet operations for Atari.
Sure.
That's where that idea came from.
Nice. Did you meet your husband at Atari Research? I read that somewhere, but I didn't know if that was right.
I had my children with Eric Cultine. I was in a lot of different relationships. I guess before Eric, I was in a long-term lesbian relationship. And I remember when I had my second child, my ex-lover came out and held one knee because Eric was off somewhere. And the gynecologist looks at Linda and says, "Oh, she looks just like you." So that was funny. So Eric and I were married for 10 years. We had 2 beautiful children. We parted ways. There were some other relationships in there. And I met the husband I'm with now at work at Interval. And he had a little girl too. And so we raised the 3 of them together.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Tell me about your end of your time at Atari, please.
Well, they were the big, after Atari crashed, when they buried all those ET cartridges in the desert, went from something like a $200 million company to sucking wind in a very short time. And part of that, that was the culture of Atari. They figured at the top that if they got a license to a good property, like ET, that would sell the product. Well, the poor bastard who had to design that was given like 2 months or something.
Right.
There was no collaborative work on the game mechanics as far as I know. It sucked as a game. So did the Superman game. And it's because management didn't take it seriously that design was a real thing that took time and thought and collaboration. Now the guys working on those games knew that. And we had a couple suicides over there from people under too much pressure. Coco D's, bullets in the brain, driving a sports car off a cliff. They were pushed really, really hard. And these guys had a completely wrong business model. They didn't understand the notion of quality, period. So What did you ask me about? So there was this massive layoff after the shit started to hit the fan. Research lasted longer than a lot of places, but the big day of the big layoff was just like, I compare it to the fall of Saigon, right? People are breaking out windows and dropping monitors into the open trunks of their cars. One guy came into the lab with a comb that he played, and he called it a, I can't remember, some kind of big piece of computing equipment, signed the property pass, and then left with that big piece of computer equipment because he had a property pass. And the guys at the desk didn't know any better. You know, it was a rout. We got a little bit of severance pay, I think. But 5,000, 10,000 people bought it that day.
Yeah.
It was nasty.
So next you landed at Activision. Did you work on any Atari stuff when you were there?
No. At Activision, I produced the LucasArts games of that time, and also did a bunch of spec work. I was a friend of Ian Ballantyne's, a guy who invented the paperback book, and his wife was the publisher of Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, Heinlein. I mean, she put science fiction on the map. Okay, so Ian and I were having lunch in New York one day, and he said he had just received a copy of a book called The Space Shuttle Operator's Manual, and gave it to me, and it was awesome, and the graphics were great, and it was easy to understand. So I took it to Activision and said, we got to do this. We have to do this. And it's like, no, nobody played that. It's too technical. And then I worked with Howard Rheingold on a dream memory thing, a dream journal product that would help you when you just groggy woke up, do things with symbols to put a dream together. No, nobody played that. Well, then Activision, I told the guys at Activision that I was pregnant, and 2 weeks later they fired me. So there was that. And I tried to sue them, but at the time there were no laws to protect me, and they had big pockets. So I produced some cool stuff at Activision. I'm really proud of the LucasArts stuff, and some other things, but in general, again, you know, it's a kind of a toxic culture, nothing like Atari, but toxic enough that they were going to fire somebody for being pregnant. So, cool.
Jumping ahead, what do you do with yourself today?
Well, my goodness, I don't get to talk about interval. Well, we can do that another time if you want. I'm retired. I spent the last 15 years of my career in higher education. I founded the Interactive Media Design Graduate Program at Art Center College of Design, which is a wonderful program, and it's thriving now. So I'm pleased about that. And Ann Burdick has been a wonderful chair for that program. I got hired away by California College of the Arts 6 years later to do the same thing for them. So we did a transmedia graduate program, meaning that students had to achieve some level of competence in ID, interaction design, and graphic design, because we know that these things all get smeared together in the practice of our craft, right? And so that lasted 6 years. That one did not go well. The president who hired me left the next year, and they hired a new president who didn't get it and was sort of in the pockets of the really old, crufty graphic design people who were very possessive of their stuff. And I was sort of like, you know, Chinese water torture. Finally, they tried to boot me as chair after conducting a review that was not done properly and did not happen on time, and in which I had got great marks from my colleagues and my students. So I hired a wonderful attorney, a wonderful African-American lesbian attorney from Oakland. They were always talking about diversity at CCA, so I thought that was a good move. And I sued him, and I got some money out of him. And then I made the mistake of thinking I could just carry on. I went to work at UC Santa Cruz for a while, but again, we had a boys club. And it's not that way now, but it was when I was there, and it was extremely difficult. And I lacked support from fellow instructors and researchers on any kind of projects I wanted to do, including NSF grant stuff. So by the time I'm 65 in 2015, I'm like, well, this may be a sad ending to the story, but it's not the end of the book. I can retire now. So now I'm doing a lot of writing. I'm doing consulting. I was on the global IXDA board until just February, I guess. And I co-chaired the IXDA Global Conference last year. I've been on the board of the Communication Research Institute of Australia, which recently just folded. It had a really good run. So I do some board work, some consulting. Right now, I'm really concerned with. I've been spending a lot of time working on the concept of Gaia, trying to understand it better, of the way our planet is a whole system that tends towards homeostatic behavior, and we fuck it up enough that goes away. So getting the notion of how deeply things are interconnected into people's brains, I think is really important. And there's a lot of good science. So I've been working as a consultant on some projects that are looking at how we might do that using VR and AR. I've been writing scenarios of using AR to help kids understand the natural world better. So I'm not done. I'm not done.
Awesome. A couple of last quick questions. I know you have places to go. I found a file on a weird janky hacker site in Greece or something, that it's your research memos from Atari that you had saved. May I copy that and put that on Internet Archive so it's just easier to people to get to?
Yeah, if it's already out there, I don't have any say.
Okay. But it is your copyright, so I just want to make sure. Do you happen to have the other research memos written by other people in the lab, because they don't exist?
No, I don't. I don't know what happened to that stuff. And a similar thing occurred at Interval because Paul Allen, bless his pointy little head, thought that we shouldn't publish. And in fact, after he took the company down 2 years earlier than he said he would, he became a patent whore. He was out there selling our stuff. We had a couple startups that almost worked. Purple Moon was one of them. And Purple Moon didn't survive because Paul pulled his funding, because the grass was greener on the internet side of the street. You didn't have to have a business plan. You didn't have to have a revenue model. You didn't have to make real stuff and keep it in a warehouse and ship it to somebody. So the grass was greener, and he just, jackbooted thugs came in, and that was the end of that. So that was a disappointment. But I'll tell you, the community that formed there, I mean, there are people I know, like Steve Saunders, that I've worked with, Atari, Telepresence Research, which I co-founded with Scott, Interval, they're always Sun. These people are always there. It's a posse. And that's one of the coolest things about Silicon Valley for me, is that I developed a community of people that I kept seeing over and over again, with shared ethics, shared goals in most cases, and an intent to make the world a better place, to do good. And I feel just tremendously blessed by that. Nice. I miss those guys.
Here's my final question. If you could send a message to the people who are still using their Atari computers today, what would you, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Well, I'm so happy you're doing that. And if you haven't pigged out on Star Raiders, go for it. I played that game until finally, after 6 months of maniacal playing, I was able to see the pattern in the generated sky. And that kind of ruined it for me. I'm not an FPS guy. My thoughts about that game, here's what I'd say to you, Atari players. If you play Star Raiders, how would you make it a better game? How about a negotiate button? We could do that now.
Sure.
How would you make it a better game? I would love to see answers to that question.
Thank you so much for your time, Brenda. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Kay. It was a blast.